The VTC meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is protection of civilians in armed conflict, protection of civilians from conflict-induced hunger. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Dongyu, Director General of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Mr. David Beasley, Executive Director of the United Nations World Food Program. And Mr. Jan Egeland, Secretary General for the Norwegian Refugee Council. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2020/299, a letter dated 14 April 2020 from the representative of the Dominican Republic to the United Nations, addressed to the Secretary General, transmitting a concept paper on the item under consideration. I now give the floor to Mr. Dongyu. It is a pleasure having you
here. Thank you, Mr. President, for your invitation. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. President, for your invitation. I feel greatly welcome the Council's engagement on this important subject and your continued recognition of the relationship between the conflict and hunger. While addressing you today, it is of course impossible to ignore COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on the food security. Let me assure you that the FAO is working at all levels to reduce the risk of the pandemic disrupting food systems and causing a global food crisis with our members. Excellencies, today I will focus on 3 central elements. First, the 2020 Global Report on Food Crisis and how it clearly shows the linkage between the conflict and the rising level of acute food insecurity. Second, the connection between livelihood interventions and the peace processes. And third, the importance of early warning and quick reaction to preempt food insecurity caused by the conflicts. Early today, I just said 5 minutes ago, I was invited by the G20 presidency on behalf of RBS in Rome, WFP, FAO, and IFAD, and the EU, and others. So we together with them and 17 other partners launched the 2020 edition of the Global Report on Food Crisis. According to the report, 135 million people in 55 countries experienced acute food insecurity in 2019. Excellencies, today I will focus on 3 that, and as I mentioned, and this is a substantial rising over the last 4 years. Actually, it's the highest during past 4 years. Almost 60% of all those people in 2019 did so in context of conflict or instability. In South Sudan, for instance, where over 6 million people, almost more than half its population, are expected to face a crisis level of food insecurity or even worse. That will likely deteriorate further between the May and the July to almost 6.5 million people. And in Yemen, which remains the world's worst food and malnutrition crisis in 2020, the number of acutely food insecure people is expected to exist at 17 million. The risk of famine persists, particularly if port operations are disrupted by the conflict. Mr. President, distinguished members, coherent actions are needed among the humanitarian, development, peace actors to address the root causes of acute food insecurity. FAO's experience shows that the interventions supporting livelihood and food security contribute to local peace and broader peace processes. Because the intervention addressed not only the symptom, but also the root causes of conflict. And this goes to the essence of the Sustainable Development Goals that we work to achieve by 2030. For example, in the Sahel, over 12 million people experienced acute food insecurity there last year. And in the many areas, the relationship between farmers and the pastors, headers, which was once cooperative, have become a confrontation as a compete of the same scarce resources. Unfortunately, we expect this number to rise to over 17 million during the coming lean season. Despite the large-scale internationally backed effort, peace remains fragile. This has been particularly the case for pastoral and agro-pastoral communities, whose livelihood have been increasingly eroded in the Sahel and as well. Pastoralism represents one of the most viable livelihood options in the dry land, making enormous contribution to social, environmental, economic well-being. In West Africa and the Sahel, livestock production contributed up to 44% of agricultural GDPs. But the marginalization and the neglect of the pastoral community, as well as the depletion of natural resources on which they rely, left them exposed. FAO and other agencies are strengthening the resilience of these communities with a focus on cross-border areas such as in the Lep-Toka Gama region of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, where insecurity and fragility are particularly acute. Mr. President, Excellencies, conflict prevention acted earlier to reduce the impacts of the conflict are highly effective steps that can be taken to avert and reduce acute food insecurity. And we need prevention as the forecast for food security in 2020 look bleak. Conflict, extreme weather, desert locusts, economic shocks, and now the COVID-19 are likely to push more people into acute food insecurity. But by closing monitoring evaluation of this shock, we can rapidly intervene to mitigate their impact. We are committed to rising to these challenges, and we have mobilized our organization in ways not seen since the foundation of the UN. Because the evidence is clear, widespread conflict and instability leads to food insecurity. Reducing or preventing conflict, reducing and prevent hunger. FAO will continue supporting the Security Council by providing professional consultation with updated information and analysis on food security in conflict contexts. That will facilitate the Council's timely action to avert food crisis. Mr. President, honorable members, non-traditional security will be an unavoidable problem closely related to the food system and the rural development. My appreciation to all the Council members for your continued attention to the direct linkage between conflict and food security along with the rural development. Thank you. Thank you very much. Over to you. Mr. President, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chu, for your briefing. I now give the floor to David Beasley.
Thank you, Mr. President, and of course, thank you for the opportunity to brief the Security Council today on this very, very important issue. And forgive me for speaking bluntly, but I'd like to lay out for you very clearly what the world is facing at this very moment. At the same time, while we're dealing with COVID-19 pandemic, we're also on the brink of a hunger pandemic. In my conversations with world leaders over the past many months, before the coronavirus even became an issue, I was saying that 2020 would be facing the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II for a variety of reasons, such as the war in Syria, Yemen, the deepening crisis in places like South Sudan. And as John Egeland, I know, will no doubt set out about Burkina Faso in the central Sahel region. The desert locust swarms in Africa, as the Director General Chu highlighted in his remarks, and more frequent natural disasters and changing weather patterns that we're experiencing. The economic crisis in Lebanon, which is impacting millions of Syrian refugees, DRC, Sudan, Ethiopia, and the list goes on. We're already facing a perfect storm. So today with COVID-19, I want to stress that we're not only facing a global health pandemic, but also a global humanitarian catastrophe. Millions of civilians living in conflict-scarred nations, including many women and children, face being pushed to the brink of starvation, with the specter of famine a very real and dangerous possibility. This might sound truly shocking, but let me give you just some numbers. 821 million people go to bed hungry every night all over the world, chronically hungry. And as Dr. Chu just pointed out, as the new global report on food crisis that's published today shows, there are a further 135 million people facing crisis levels of hunger or worse. That means 135 million people on Earth are marching toward the brink of starvation. But now the World Food Program analysis shows also, due to the coronavirus, that an additional 130 million people could be pushed to the brink of starvation by the end of 2020. That's a total of 265 million people. On any given day now, WFP, we offer a lifeline to about 100 million people, up from about 80 million just a few years ago. This includes about 30 million people who literally depend on us to stay alive. If we can't reach these people with the life-saving assistance they need, our analysis shows that 300,000 people could starve to death every single day over a 3-month period. This does not even include the increase of starvation due to COVID. In a worst-case scenario, we could be looking at famine in about 36 countries. And in fact, 10 of these countries, we already have more than 1 million people per country who are on the verge of starvation. And in many places, this human suffering is a heavy price of conflict. At WFP, we are proud that the Council made the historic decision to pass Resolution 2417 in May 2018. It was amazing to see the Council come together. Now we have to live up to our pledge to protect the most vulnerable and act immediately to save lives around the world. But this is only, in my opinion, the first part of the strategy needed to protect conflict-riven countries from a hunger pandemic caused by the coronavirus. There's also a real danger that more people could potentially die from the economic impact of COVID-19 than from the virus itself. This is why I'm talking about a hunger pandemic. It is critical that we come together as one united global community to defeat this disease and protect the most vulnerable nations and communities from its potentially devastating effects. Lockdowns, economic recessions are expected to lead to a major loss of income among the working poor. Overseas remittances will also drop sharply. This will hurt countries like Haiti, Nepal, and Somalia, just to name a couple. The loss of tourism receipts will damage countries like Ethiopia, where it accounts for 47% of its total exports. The collapsing oil prices in lower income countries like South Sudan will have an impact significantly, where oil accounts for 98.8% of total exports. And of course, when donor countries' revenues are down, how much impact will this have on life-saving foreign aid? The economic and health impacts of COVID-19 are most worrisome for communities in countries across Africa as well as the Middle East, because the virus threatens further damage to the lives and the livelihoods of people already put at risk by conflict. WFP and our partners are going all out to help them. We'll do everything we possibly can. For example, we know that children are particularly vulnerable to hunger and malnutrition, so we are prioritizing assistance to them. Right now, as you may know, 1.6 billion children and young people are currently out of school around the world due to the lockdown. Nearly 370 million children of these children are missing out on nutritious school meals. You can only imagine when children don't get the nutrition, which means their immunity systems are down. But this is why we are providing nutritious school meals where we possibly can in these suspended areas to help, whether it's take-home rations to help the families and help these children. As you know, WFP is a logistic backbone for the humanitarian world, and even more so now for the global effort to beat this pandemic. We have delivered millions upon millions of personal protective equipment, testing kits, face masks to about 78 countries on behalf of the World Health Organization. We are also running humanitarian air services to get frontline health professionals, doctors, nurses, and humanitarian staff into countries that need help, especially while the passenger airline industry is basically about shut down. But we need to do more than this, and I urge the Council to lead the way. First and foremost, we need peace. As the Secretary General recently said very clearly, a global ceasefire is essential right now. Second, we need all parties involved in the conflicts to give us swift and unimpeded humanitarian access to all vulnerable communities so that we can get the assistance to them that they need, regardless of who they are or where they are. We also need, in a very general sense, humanitarian goods and commercial trade to continue flowing across the borders because they are the lifeline of global food systems as well as the global economy. Supply chains have to keep moving if we are going to overcome this pandemic and get food from where it is produced to where it is needed. It also means resisting the temptation to introduce like export bans or import subsidies, which can lead to price hikes and almost always backfire. WFP, we're already working hand in glove with governments to build and strengthen national safety nets. This is critical right now to ensure fair access to assistance and to help maintain peace and stability and prevent rising tensions among communities. Third, we need coordinated action to support life-saving humanitarian assistance. For example, WFP, we are implementing plans to pre-position 3 months worth of food and cash to serve country operations identified as priorities. We're asking donors to accelerate the $1.9 billion in funding that has already been pledged so that we can build stockpiles and create the life-saving buffers and protect the most vulnerable from the effects of supply chain disruptions, commodity shortages, economic damage, and lockdowns. You understand exactly what I'm talking about. We're also requesting a further $350 million to set up a network of logistics hubs and transportation systems to keep the humanitarian supply chains moving around the world. They will also provide field hospitals and medical evacuations to the frontline humanitarians and health workers as needed and strategically. Excellencies, 2 years ago, the Security Council took a landmark step when it recognized and condemned the devastating human toll that conflict paid in poverty and hunger. Resolution 2417, it also highlighted the need for early warning systems. And today, I'm here to raise that alarm. There are no famines yet, but I must warn you that if we don't prepare and act now to secure access, avoid funding shortfalls, and disruptions to trade, we could be facing multiple famines of biblical proportions within a short few months. The actions that we take will determine our success or failure in building sustainable food systems as the basis of stable and peaceful societies. The truth is, we do not have time on our side, so let's act wisely and let's act fast. I do believe that our expertise and our partnerships, we can bring together the teams and the programs necessary to make certain the COVID-19 pandemic does not become a human and food crisis catastrophe. So, Mr. President, thank you very much.
That is a very clear warning call. I thank Mr. Beasley for his briefing, and I give the floor to Mr. Jennings Egeland.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, honored council members. My colleagues from FAO and World Food Programme has so well described the urgency of the global food insecurity situation, and also what David Beasley just mentioned, a hunger pandemic is looming. I lead a large humanitarian field-based group. I will concentrate on our need for the Security Council to help us with our field-based obstacles to reach Hungary in war. Because in my 40 years as a humanitarian worker, I've never seen as many people displaced by conflict as now. We see more, longer, crueler conflicts cause mounting hunger as families flee their homes, their farms, their fields, and their livelihoods, and they become dependent on the generosity of host communities that themselves are in a precarious situation. To make this storm even worse, we see climate-induced disasters now hitting both host and displaced, and this in turn deepens the hunger crisis and further displaces people. Perhaps nowhere in the world is this more evident as a vicious cycle than in the central Sahel region and the Lake Chad basin in Africa that I recently visited. In Burkina Faso, there has been a tenfold increase in forced displacement in just 1 year, from 70,000 to 750,000 people. Nowhere else in the world have seen such a tenfold increase in displacement. In the small northern town of Barcelona that I then just visited just before the coronavirus pandemic, tens of thousands of people had been displaced by numerous armed groups. Who were there were single mother-led families. The grown men were targeted by the extremist violence, so fathers and husbands were either dead or had fled further away. These women and children are suffering alone and unprotected. We were only a couple of aid groups present in this large area, and we are overstretched and underfunded. There are no public services nor any law or order in sight. Most families there had gotten some basic shelter, but they were in acute need of everything else. Teachers had also fled because there were targeted violence against education. Food insecurity had increased threefold. A family of 8 shared 20 liters of water per day. So how can you avoid the coronavirus with 1,000 huts next to each other, with 10 people in each small shelter and 3 liters of water for drinking, food and hygiene per person per day? So we see the same food and relief crisis across the Sahel, from Mali to Lake Chad. There is, in my view, an over-reliance on counter-terrorist military responses. Too little is done to address root causes of violence, such as massive unemployment, lack of education, abject poverty, lack of good governance, and lack of hope for the large generation of young people. If we go beyond Sahel, it's the same picture elsewhere in conflict and crisis, and I have 5 concrete asks to make of the Security Council. First, we need safe and unimpeded humanitarian access to everyone, everywhere. As a frontline humanitarian agency, you must help us to reach communities in need in these conflict areas. States have an obligation to facilitate impartial humanitarian aid according to humanitarian law. Yet when we try to reach children, women and men, all civilians, with life-saving relief, we face every day and in multiple conflict settings, obstacles, roadblocks and prohibitions. Both assertive governments and non-state armed groups are blatantly denying civilians access to food relief. We urge the Security Council to avoid politicizing access to aid and rather by default enable us as humanitarian actors to provide relief wherever and whenever there are unmet needs, across front lines, across borders, across political, religious and ethnic lines. UN Security Council Resolution 2165 for cross-border relief in Syria is an example of the type of mechanisms we humanitarians need. Second point, we need stronger humanitarian diplomacy. The missions deployed by you as Security Council, as well as your bilateral diplomatic missions, must give priority to humanitarian diplomacy with parties and actors so that we can reach people with food and other assistance. Now, from 2016 to 2018, I chaired the Humanitarian Task Force on Access in Syria with 25 influential UN member states, including the P5 of the Security Council. The task force was set up after horrific reports of children starving to death in besieged towns in Syria. Within 72 hours after the creation of this task force in February 2016, convoys were rolling for the first time to many of these besieged areas that were starving. Humanitarian diplomacy by states was the key factor to enable this. When many besieged areas were again denied food and hunger again took hold, it was primarily, in my view, because the pressure on the parties by states was waning. Third point.
You are the only participant.
We need to strengthen the instrument of deconfliction. Deconfliction by informing parties of protected humanitarian sites, hospitals and aid convoys is a key tool to enable us to reach civilians without being attacked. And when military commanders are informed of when, where and what will be supplied of food and other relief items, they have an obligation to ensure that this is a safe and secure relief convoys. We have often seen convoys get through to places of hunger and hopelessness after having been successfully deconflicted with multiple governmental armed forces and non-state armed groups. But in other places, we have seen deconflicted hospitals, schools, camps, and convoys attacked and bombed. So deconfliction and humanitarian diplomacy can work even in the cruelest of wars, but the information provided must always be verified and accurate from us humanitarians. And most importantly, there must be accountability for attacks on protected sites. Fourth point. We need standard exemptions for humanitarian aid under counter-terrorism laws and sanctions regimes. Humanitarian work, access, supply, procurement, visas, and movements in conflict zones are increasingly affected now by counter-terror legislation and sanctions regimes. Today, in many of the conflict areas where Norwegian Refugee Council's 15,000 humanitarian workers struggle to get food and other relief items to civilians in the crossfires, we are delayed or restrained by the lack of clear-cut exemptions for provision of humanitarian aid under all of these sanctions regimes and counterterrorism measures. And in a similar vein, the many current COVID-19 restrictions put in place by states, understandably, to avoid the virus from spreading, these COVID restrictions should always include provisions that allow coronavirus-safe humanitarian assistance to continue by designating us as humanitarian workers essential personnel like medical personnel. Otherwise, the current health crisis will provide the food crisis that David Beasley predicted. Finally, there must be monitoring, reporting, and accountability mechanisms, and they must be strengthened. I mean, the starvation of civilians in warfare and the denial of humanitarian relief are grave violations of humanitarian law for which perpetrators must be held to account. There must be consequences when men with guns and power prevent children and families from accessing food through their harvest or through aid from us. The Security Council must ensure investigations and accountability through a mechanism to monitor and report on humanitarian access and starvation crimes. Only then will generals, commanders, and politicians think twice before they deny civilians food. Starving civilians is a war crime and will never achieve legitimate military objectives. So we urge Security Council to renew its commitment to break the vicious cycle of conflict and food insecurity and to consider the points I just mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Egeland, for your briefing. I now have the honor to welcome His Excellency Miguel Vargas Maldonado, Minister of Foreign Affairs, who will make a statement on behalf of the Dominican Republic. The statement will be read in Spanish and interpreted into English.
Muy buenos días. Permítame iniciar reconociendo la labor de los gobiernos y de los organismos internacionales para mitigar los efectos del COVID-19 en la alimentación de las poblaciones más vulnerables.
Good morning. Allow me to begin by acknowledging to mitigate the effects of COVID-19 on the most vulnerable populations.
Doy la bienvenida al Dr. Chu, director general de la FAO, al señor Beasley, director ejecutivo del PMA, y al señor Egeland, secretario general del Consejo Noruego para los Refugiados.
I welcome Dr. Chu, FAO Director General, Mr. Beasley, Executive Director of the WFP, and Mr. Egeland, Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council.
Les agradecemos profundamente haber aceptado cada vez más eficientes el cumplimiento del Objetivo de Desarrollo Sostenible de Hambre Cero no está garantizado.
The COVID-19 pandemic has once again placed before us the unbearable evidence that in the 21st century, despite increasingly efficient production capacities, the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goal of zero hunger is not guaranteed.
La FAO, que certificó a República Dominicana entre los países que alcanzaron la meta de hambre y malnutrición de los Objetivos de Desarrollo del Milenio, indica que mi país sí está en camino de lograrlo.
The FAO, which recognized the Dominican Republic as being among the countries that achieved the Millennium Development Goal of reducing hunger and malnutrition, indicates that my country is on track to attain it.
Sin embargo, esta crisis amenaza la posibilidad de que muchos países en desarrollo puedan erradicar el hambre.
However, the current crisis threatens the possibility that many developing countries can eradicate hunger.
El informe conjunto de la FAO, el PMA, el FIDA, la OMS y UNICEF sobre el estado de la seguridad alimentaria y la nutrición en el mundo indica que el número de personas en estado de inseguridad alimentaria en 2019 es de 821.6 millones, aproximadamente 1 millón más que el año anterior, lo que refleja que la situación del hambre ha permanecido al menos estancada o con un ligero empeoramiento.
The joint report produced by FAO, WFP, IFAD, WHO, and UNICEF on the state of food security and nutrition in the world reveals that 821.6 million people are in a state of food insecurity, approximately 1 million more than the previous year, which suggests that the state of hunger has remained at least stagnant or has slightly worsened.
Las perspectivas de la crisis económica y social que arropará el planeta en la segunda mitad del 2020 auguran retrocesos.
The prospects of the social and economic crisis that will engulf the globe in the second half of 2020 portend negative developments.
La desigualdad económica y la pobreza extrema, pero también el cambio climático y las catástrofes naturales son factores que afectan la seguridad alimentaria, al igual que los conflictos.
Economic inequality, extreme poverty, climate change, and natural catastrophes, as well as conflicts, are undeniable factors that contribute to food insecurity.
El auge de los conflictos violentos internos desde el 2010 es responsable de más de la mitad de las personas aquejadas de inseguridad alimenticia crónica.
The rise of internal conflicts since 2010 is responsible for more than half of those suffering from chronic food insecurity.
La aprobación unánime en 2018 de la resolución 2417 representó un paso histórico.
The unanimous adoption of Resolution 2417 in 2018 represents a milestone.
Al reconocer la relación explícita entre conflictos armados e inseguridad alimentaria, dotó a la comunidad internacional de pautas para impedir que estos se transformen en catástrofes alimenticias para las poblaciones civiles.
The acknowledgement of a clear relationship between armed conflict and food insecurity provided the international community with guidelines to prevent them from becoming food crises for civilian populations.
Es oportuno en este contexto aplicar el marco de acción para crisis prolongadas del Comité de Seguridad Alimentaria Mundial.
In this context, it's timely to apply the framework for action in protracted crisis of the Committee on World Food Security.
Deseo referirme también al vínculo entre la inseguridad alimentaria y la estabilidad política.
I will also like to refer to the link between food insecurity and political stability.
La evidencia es ya irrefutable. La inseguridad alimentaria es caldo de cultivo para el conflicto, aún más si se suman la desigualdad y la fragilidad institucional.
The evidence is irrefutable. Food insecurity is a breeding ground for conflict, even more so if paired with inequality and institutional weakness.
El hambre, el aumento de las tensiones sociales y los desplazamientos de población pueden traducirse en mayor presión económica y social para los países receptores, muchas veces aquejados de diversas vulnerabilidades.
Hunger and increasing social tensions and the displacement of population can result in increased social and economic pressure for host countries, often affected with diverse vulnerabilities.
El hambre afecta a más de 40 millones de personas en América Latina y el Caribe.
Hunger affects more than 40 million people in Latin America and the Caribbean.
La subalimentación se cuadruplicó en Venezuela entre 2014 y 2018, coincidiendo con una grave recesión económica y con un éxodo masivo de personas.
Undernourishment quadrupled in Venezuela between 2014 and 2018, which occurred simultaneously with a severe economic recession and a mass exodus of people.
La situación de Haití, por otro lado, exige la atención urgente y reclama la solidaridad de la comunidad internacional.
The situation in Haiti, on the other hand, requires urgent attention and calls for the solidarity of the international community.
Según el reporte publicado en enero del 2020 por el PMA y la FAO, 3.7 millones de haitianos se encuentran en situación de severa inseguridad alimenticia.
According to the report published in January 2020 by the WFP and FAO, 3.7 million Haitians are in a state of severe food insecurity.
La experiencia colombiana nos sirve para recordar el círculo vicioso entre el conflicto, el desplazamiento de personas y el hambre.
The lessons learned from Colombia serve as a reminder of the vicious circle of conflict, displacement of people, and hunger.
Excelencias, se
Excellencies,
precisa de acciones oportunas para mejorar la seguridad alimentaria y la nutrición y entenderlas como iniciativas que contribuyen al mantenimiento de la paz.
Excellencies, timely actions are needed to improve food security and nutrition, and they must be understood as initiatives that contribute to peacekeeping.
Intervenciones tempranas pueden mitigar los efectos del conflicto sobre los medios de subsistencia y el acceso a la alimentación.
Early actions can mitigate the effects of conflict on livelihoods and access to food.
Esta preocupación debe permanecer vigente en la agenda de este Consejo de Seguridad a través de la diplomacia humanitaria y de sus misiones de paz.
This concern must remain on the agenda of the Security Council by means of humanitarian diplomacy and peacekeeping missions.
No hay una receta única para abordar situaciones multidimensionales.
There is no one-size-fits-all approach to multidimensional situations.
Muchos países afectados por conflicto también sufren los efectos adversos del cambio climático, interacción que en contextos ya vulnerables implica una seria amenaza a la Agenda 2030.
Many countries affected by conflict also suffer the adverse effects of climate change, an interaction that, in already vulnerable contexts, implies a serious threat for the 2030 agenda.
Como tantas veces, las mujeres, los niños y los envejecientes están entre los más afectados. Igual así, los refugiados o desplazados internos.
As it often happens, women, children, and the elderly are affected, as well as refugees and internally displaced people.
Es imperativo aunar esfuerzos para fortalecer los pilares de paz, seguridad, desarrollo, medio ambiente y asistencia humanitaria de estas Naciones Unidas.
It is imperative to combine efforts to strengthen the pillars of peace, security, development, environment, and humanitarian assistance of the United Nations.
El secretario general, los estados, las agencias especializadas del sistema, actores humanitarios y de desarrollo y las mismas comunidades afectadas deben contar con las herramientas de información, análisis, alerta temprana y acción concertada para hacer frente a la inseguridad alimentaria inducida por los conflictos y agravada por el cambio climático, las crisis económicas y actualmente por la pandemia del COVID-19.
The Secretary General states specialized agencies of the system, humanitarian and development actors, and the affected communities themselves must have the information, analysis, and early warning tools, as well as concerted efforts to face conflict-induced food insecurity, exacerbated by climate change, economic crisis, and now the COVID-19 pandemic.
Como ya he mencionado, las Naciones Unidas acredita que la República Dominicana ha asumido la seguridad alimentaria como un eje central de su acción gubernamental.
As I previously mentioned, the United Nations recognizes that the Dominican Republic has undertaken food security as a key component of its governmental policies.
Hemos declarado el 2020 como año de la consolidación de la seguridad alimentaria, a partir de un plan nacional para lograr que todos los dominicanos tengan acceso a una alimentación adecuada y estén protegidos contra el hambre.
We declare the year 2020 as Year of the Consolidation of Food Security, based on a national plan to ensure that all Dominicans have access to proper nutrition and are protected against hunger.
La prioridad dada a la seguridad alimentaria pasa, además, por un mayor compromiso a nivel internacional.
The priority given to food security urges greater commitment at the international level.
Sabemos que el mundo no logrará sus objetivos compartidos de desarrollo sin satisfacer sus necesidades alimenticias y de nutrición.
We know that the world will not achieve its shared goals of development without satisfying its food and nutrition needs.
Nos complace haber tenido la oportunidad de reabrir este debate en este momento clave en medio de esta pandemia, el COVID-19, que hoy constituye una verdadera amenaza global, para reflexionar sobre cómo adaptar nuestra respuesta en esta coyuntura tan compleja. Muchas gracias.
We are pleased to have had the opportunity to reopen this debate during this critical moment in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, which currently constitutes a real global threat, in order to reflect on how to adapt our response during this complex situation. Thank you very much.
We thank Minister Vargas for his statement, and now we resume our function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I would like you to, if you may, Jose, to pass on our welcome and thanks to the Foreign Minister for being with us today. And I wanted, before him, to congratulate the Dominican Republic on your efforts to ensure that this issue is properly discussed and debated, and also to ensure transparency for the Security Council in so doing. So thank you, Jose, for that. Let me also thank our briefers today, but more importantly, I think, thank them and their teams, and their vast teams in many cases, for the actions that they are carrying out around the world in some of the most dangerous places. And it's particularly nice to see David Beasley back and well. Our briefers today have rung a huge alarm bell about situations across the world. And they've all made clear that the world, as the world faces this COVID-19 pandemic, this issue presents an ever more urgent challenge. Many people will die from this virus, but it's a sad reality that every year many people will also die from food insecurity caused by conflict. And the risk of a further knock-on impact from the virus on the food supply was made very clear by our briefers. Colleagues, well-fed people, put simply, have a better chance of survival. And so I would urge all member states today to respond generously to existing humanitarian appeals. Now, the UK is one of the largest humanitarian donors. But humanitarian aid is a last resort. It's a sign of political failure. And Mr. President, I want to focus today on two countries on this Council's agenda, Yemen and Syria, whilst recognising the important comments made by our briefers on other situations in the world. In Yemen, more than half of the population, a staggering 15.9 million people, are severely food insecure. And we therefore urge the Yemeni political leaders, particularly the Houthis, to respond constructively to the call by the Secretary General and his Special Representative to immediately cease hostilities, focus on reaching a negotiated settlement, and do everything possible to counter a potentially disastrous outbreak of COVID-19. And that must include in facilitating unimpeded humanitarian access. Taking these actions is more important than ever to avoid a worsening of food insecurity and the already dire humanitarian situation in Yemen. Political leaders must now show real leadership, and they must act in the interests of their people. In northwest Syria, the United Nations reports increased rates of stunting from malnutrition. Today, 3 out of 10 displaced children under 5 years old in the Idlib region are stunted. The Syrian regime will not allow aid to flow from Damascus to the civilians in that area. So those children, like millions of other civilians in northwest Syria, are entirely reliant on the cross-border delivery of humanitarian aid. It is crucial, therefore, that this Council renews UN Security Council Resolution 2504 before it expires in July, to allow the United Nations and its humanitarian partners to deliver the food, medical items, and other assistance that people so desperately require. And beyond the northwest, we're deeply concerned for the fate of civilians all over Syria and need to see effective humanitarian access across the country. And that concern is why the UK has given over $4 billion since the conflict began to Syria and Syrian refugees in neighbouring countries. Mr. President, it is unacceptable, illegal and inhumane to use hunger as a weapon of war. We call on all parties to conflict to recall their obligations under international humanitarian law to protect the most vulnerable, including women, children, persons with disabilities, older persons, refugees and internally displaced persons. But Mr. President, this Council's response to this challenge must include horizon scanning for future problems. In UNSCR 2417, the Council asked the Secretary-General to provide it with early warning about conflict-related famine and food insecurity conditions. Through this mechanism, the Council has considered the situations in Yemen and in South Sudan. And it is our hope that the Secretary-General will consider further ways to continue responding in a timely manner to this request, and Member States should not constrain his ability to do so. This Council must also be prepared to take robust action to ensure the flow of humanitarian assistance to populations in need. In Security Council Resolution 2417, the Council recalled that it could consider adopting targeted sanctions where appropriate and in line with existing practices, which would apply to individuals or entities obstructing the delivery or distribution of humanitarian assistance to people in need, whilst ensuring they do not negatively impact principled humanitarian assistance. So just as it is vital that this Council takes steps to ensure that humanitarian assistance can be received quickly and that the necessary exemptions are made from its sanctions regimes to do so, as we have done recently with respect to North Korea, so too we must pursue those individual actors impeding aid getting to those who so desperately need it. Mr. President, in 2018, at the adoption of Resolution 2417, the United Kingdom's representative concluded his intervention by saying, and I quote, "The lesson is clear. Humanitarian aid can only ever be a sticking plaster. The solutions are political." Mr. President, that remains the case. Thank you.
The representative of the United Kingdom. I now give the floor to the representative of Estonia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me first also thank the briefers for their excellent briefings and welcome and thank your minister for participating in our today's meeting. Mr. President, almost 2 years ago, in May 2018, the Council adopted Resolution 2417, recognizing the link between armed conflict, violence, conflict-induced food insecurity, and the threat of famine. It also strongly condemned the use of starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. We know that the need for humanitarian aid is rising. Today, the relevance of conflict-induced hunger has not decreased. On the contrary, especially now due to the outbreak of the pandemic, it is even more relevant. The pandemic has already had a massive impact in every possible way on our everyday lives. The impact has been felt more profoundly, especially by the most vulnerable in conflict situations where resources have always been scarce. And just this morning, I read a prediction that the economic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic can well double the number of people suffering from hunger from 130 million to 265 million. Most of the food insecure people in the world live in countries affected by armed conflicts, which have devastating humanitarian consequences, hindering an effective humanitarian response. Sometimes humanitarian aid is everything that people have. One can only think what might happen to these people when we are not able to carry out an effective humanitarian response. We again fully support the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire. As the conflicts are put on a halt, there is a higher chance for the civilians to avoid food shortages. We cannot ignore the impact of the climate change, which plays a major role here. Climate change has reduced livelihood options in many countries and caused migration. It has also left significant parts of the population in a vulnerable condition. Climate-related security risks contribute to grievances and increase inequality and fragility, which in turn pose challenges to the implementation of UN missions everywhere. Conflict-driven food crises can be aggravated in countries where severe extreme weather phenomena are becoming more frequent. We cannot turn away from the impact of climate on food security. On the contrary, urgent action is needed to protect the most vulnerable communities. We also underline that women are key actors contributing to food security during conflict. Women are often hardest hit and have fewer alternative livelihoods when crops are lost. Ensuring their equal rights, including to household resources and land, as well as their participation in decision-making, strengthens communities' ability to manage the challenges related to food insecurity. The importance of safe and unimpeded access of humanitarian personnel to civilians in armed conflict can never be underlined enough. We call on all parties to armed conflict to comply with international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Thank you, Mr. President.
Estonia for his statement. I give now the floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President, I would like to, at the beginning, welcome Prime Minister His Excellency Miguel Vargas Maldonado to chair this open VTC. I also wish to thank Director General Chu Dongyu, Executive Director Mr. David Beasley, and Mr. Yang Egeland for their briefings. War and armed conflicts result in catastrophes and grievances. They may threaten innocent civilians' survival, destroy infrastructures, affect the development of countries concerned, but also lead to humanitarian crises, including the worsening of food security. Thus, it's recognizable that FAO, WPF, and other international organizations follow the situation very closely, keep insight on conflict-induced hunger issues, and bring focused observations and recommendations. We also appreciate the effort made by Dominican Republic in making this discussion available. The COVID-19 pandemic and the breakdown of the global industrial chain have also impacted the economies and the food security of member states. Desert locust infestations are rampant in Africa and Asia, increasing global food security risks. Against this backdrop, there is added value to have discussions on this topic. I wish to share with you the following points. First, it's imperative to prevent and resolve conflicts and promote dialogue and political settlement of hotspot issues. The Security Council should keep up to its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, and promote the resolution of conflicts through political and diplomatic means in order to relieve civilians from sufferings of war, including from hunger. We urge all relevant parties to actively support and act on the global ceasefire appeal and the cessation of hostilities made by the Secretary General. All actions should be taken by parties concerned to ensure unhindered humanitarian access, including food supply. The international community should pay higher attention to issues in Africa and support the good offices and the mediation efforts of the African Union and other regional organizations. Second, it's essential to promote inclusive and balanced development and always put development at the core place. It's difficult to achieve development without peace. What's also true is that it's hard to realize sustaining peace without development. Development is fundamental to resolving various global issues. It's especially important to support the efforts of Africa and other regions to eradicate poverty and advance the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Great attention and inputs should be given to the reconstruction of conflict areas, promoting political and economic processes and the peacekeeping and the peace-building processes in parallel, while increasing the development capacity of countries concerned to prevent food crises and other humanitarian disasters fundamentally. Third, it's critical to strengthen international cooperation and set favorable conditions to promote global food security. The international community should jointly take urgent actions to ensure unobstructed global food supply chain and maintain food supply and price stability. We must support FAO and WFP in playing their unique coordinating role in providing humanitarian assistance to countries concerned to prevent large-scale famine. Unilateral sanctions must be lifted as soon as possible. Member states should stabilize the industrial supply chains, reduce tariff barriers, facilitate trade, and ensure the uninterrupted global supply of food and agricultural products. Humanitarian operations should be conducted in accordance with the purposes and the principles of the UN Charter and the relevant humanitarian guiding principles, while respecting sovereignty of countries concerned. Mr. President, China as a large agricultural nation, attaches great importance to food security. On the basis of achieving food self-sufficiency, China is always actively engaged in international cooperation in agriculture and food. We have provided assistance to other developing countries within our capacity, among other means, by carrying out projects together with FAO in the framework of South-South cooperation, and sending experts and technicians to Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean region. Since the outbreak of COVID-19 and the Asian African locust plague, China has given active support to other countries in combating the epidemic. In active response to the FAO initiative and the requests of the relevant countries, China has sent locust control teams to share experience and help the affected countries. Positive results have been achieved. China is ready to strengthen cooperation with all parties to safeguard global food security and work together to create a world free of hunger and poverty. We are ready to provide solid support for all peoples in their quest for greater development and make greater contributions to building a world of lasting peace and common prosperity and a better future shared by all mankind. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I thank China for the statement. I would give the floor Indonesia. Should we wait for your PR?
Yes, please, Mr. President.
Yes.
No, already.
Thank
yes,
you. I will now...
I'm here.
Oh, you are here? Go ahead.
Yeah,
I give the floor.
I'm here.
You have the floor.
Sorry, there was some glitch in my system. Thank you very much, Mr. President. At the outset, I also would like to thank the presidency for convening this important briefing today. And of course, like others, to welcome the presence of the Minister of Foreign Affairs from the Dominican Republic, His Excellency Miguel Vargas, in this meeting through VTC, definitely. And I also would like to thank the briefer, the DG for Food and Agriculture Organization, Mr. Dongyu, of course, our old friend, Mr. David Beasley from the UN World Food Program, and of course, Mr. Egeland. We have missed you for quite some time in this setting of the UN. Welcome back. I think all the speakers has alluded to the important point of the global food need and has been clearly pointed out, and that's why we're having this discussion here. For us, Indonesia, we have always been in the forefront in the issue of food security and have also in our humble way assisted countries in providing assistance in this regard. And for us also, it has been very important points with regard to the protection of civilians, which will always remain Indonesia's top priority. Last year, under our Indonesia's presidency in the Council, we are proud to commemorate the 20th anniversary of protection of civilians. It will continue to be Indonesia's priority, and in this topic, we certainly appreciate it. Now, I said it before, and I will say it once again. We are all here to save lives. Protecting civilians, including from conflict-induced hunger, should always be the core aim of the Security Council. We have Resolution 2417 of 2018. Now, I think it is becoming more and more pertinent for us all to implement fully the said resolution, particularly in this time of conflict pandemic. Now, Mr. President, allow me to focus on three other important points. Firstly, hunger should never be used as a method of warfare. Parties to a conflict should respect international law, including international humanitarian law and Security Council's resolution. Nevertheless, actors who are active in most conflicts today continue to violate this. Attacks against humanitarian workers, medical mission, and civilian assets continue to persist as deliberate disruption of humanitarian access. The Council should explore innovative ways to secure their respect for global norms against harming of civilians. We continue to support the work of the Secretary General to pursue avenues in preventing and ending armed conflict. And once again, we also, in line with his call for the global ceasefire. Now, to that end, it is important now more than ever for us to adhere, as I mentioned before, for a global ceasefire and provide access for humanitarian assistance during the COVID-19 pandemic. Violence is never the solution. We should continue to promote dialogue, political negotiation, and other peaceful means. At the same time, we need to continue enhancing cooperation between humanitarian, development, and peace-building efforts. We also align ourselves with many that have called for unimpeded humanitarian access to provide relief and assistance, including food access to the needy, since right to food is a basic human right. Second, international cooperation is vital in protecting civilians. Indeed, the primary responsibility of protecting civilians falls into each country. Yet, we often found there is a gap between such responsibility and their capacity to do so. International support, including through technical and financial assistance, are truly vital to enable capacity building. The promotion of a culture of peace with right-based approach and requisite laws are equally important. Lessons learned and best practices should be shared. It is also important to open borders, ensure global supply chain, and no disruption of trade. We, as the Council, must be able to facilitate measures to strengthen countries' capacity to protect civilians, as well as sustain peace, and of course, to ensure continuity of economic activities and availability of food. Third, the imperative to protect civilians must be embedded throughout the peace continuum, from conflict prevention and peacekeeping to peace building and sustainable development. It is clear for peace to flourish, sustainable development is required. It is a synergy. The 2030 Agenda and the UN peace building architecture are the tools disposable to us in achieving this. Now let us utilize this tool. We concur with the statement of the Dominican Republic ministers on the imperative to combine efforts to strengthen the pillars of peace, security, development, environment, and humanitarian assistance of the United Nations. Mr. President, we will continue to support the central role of the UN on this matter and endure in our determination enshrined in the Charter to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. This is our collective efforts. Everyone should be engaged in that noble cause. No civilian should be left behind or left unprotected. No civilian should be left hungry. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Indonesia for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President, and let me first of all welcome His Excellency, the Foreign Minister of the Dominican Republic, and let me also thank our briefers for their comprehensive updates. They were sobering and quite alarming, I would say. Mr. President, first of all, let me congratulate you for your timely choice of the topic of today's Council meeting. Germany has joined you in hosting several informal meetings of the Security Council titled Monitoring Food Security in Countries with Conflict Situations. These briefings have illustrated the link between conflict and food insecurity on the basis of evidence from several country situations. Today's briefers made clear that conflict remains a primary driver of acute food insecurity. In 2018, the Security Council adopted Resolution 2417, condemning the use of starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, as well as the denial of humanitarian assistance in conflict situations. This landmark resolution paved the way for addressing conflict-induced hunger, underlying the clear causal link between armed conflict, food insecurity, and starvation. 2 years after the adoption of Resolution 2417, the international community expects the United Nations Security Council to act more decisively on the nexus between conflict and food insecurity. The Global Report on Food Crisis, released today, found that in 2019, 135 million people were affected by acute food insecurity, the highest number in the 4 years since reporting started. This trend needs to mobilize all actors involved in conflict prevention and resolution. Mr. President, in these days, these COVID days, we talk a lot about flattening the curve. When it comes to the nexus between conflict and food security, we actually need to get ahead of the curve. This is why prevention is so critical in this context, and this is why David Beasley's clear warning was very important today. Resolution 2417 has initiated an early warning mechanism which allows the Security Council to act prior to the onset of a hunger hazard. This can safeguard lives and preserve livelihoods. But this Council needs to reinforce its preventive approach, identify any threats to food security in conflict settings early on, and take early and appropriate action to preserve international peace and security. There is still a lot of potential for this kind of early warning, in our opinion, and we call on the UN Secretariat to closely monitor fragile countries and to report swiftly to the Council on risks of conflict-induced famine and widespread food insecurity in armed conflicts. Mr. President, Germany is a top donor for humanitarian assistance in the UN context. German humanitarian assistance places great emphasis on food security as well as on promoting a paradigm shift towards a forward-looking humanitarian system that can anticipate crisis and act very early on. Since 2015, Germany supported preventive humanitarian action of different partners with more than 30 million euros. Of all the humanitarian sectors, food assistance has received the largest amount of funding from Germany in past years. And given what we have heard today by our briefers, I can assure you that food security will certainly remain one of our priority areas for this year as well. In that context, let me also stress what many others have said before me, that is the importance which Resolution 2417 attaches to the adherence to international humanitarian law and to sustaining humanitarian access. All parties to a conflict must comply with their obligations under international law. And we as Security Council members should help create the conditions that allow humanitarian workers deliver principled humanitarian assistance and bring relief to those most in need. This is also the purpose of the humanitarian call for action, which Germany initiated together with France in April 2019, and which has been endorsed by 44 UN member states as of today. Mr. President, our briefers and some previous speakers have rightly said we need to address the root causes of food insecurity. And we have all talked about one of the main drivers, which is conflict. But there's growing evidence that there is a second main driver for food insecurity in the world, and that is climate change. The nexus between conflict, climate change, and food insecurity in an already vulnerable context has devastating impacts on civilians and poses a serious threat to achieving sustainable development. We see this in the Sahel, where tangible repercussions of the link between climate change, security, and food insecurity are flaring up between herders and farmers and have very serious implications. To secure and sustain peace in some of the world's most fragile contexts like the Sahel, support to agricultural livelihood should be considered as one part of a holistic response. This is why this Council has to deal with this nexus between climate and security, climate and food insecurity. We need to act at the right time, and we need to live up to the world's expectations. And in our opinion, this Council needs to act on this nexus very strongly and clearly. Mr. President, before concluding, let me say a word on COVID-19 related issues. In view of around 183 million people at risk of slipping into acute food insecurity, if confronted by an additional shock or stressor, as the global report on food crisis released today underlined, we are concerned about the impact of pandemics on food security. Unfortunately, the pandemic disproportionately affects those groups that already belong to the most vulnerable. And we fully concur with DSG Amina Mohammed's assessment that the risks faced by people everywhere go far beyond the virus itself. At the moment, sufficient amounts of food are available, but the threat of supply chain disruptions due to work, travel, and trade restriction is obvious and clear. To avoid rising hunger levels due to COVID-19, not only unimpeded access to means of production need to be maintained, but also workers in agriculture, logistics, processing, and distribution have to remain available and therefore need to be adequately protected. Therefore, we expect that large-scale humanitarian assistance will be required to prevent and cope with the consequences of the disease on food security and to deliver support to millions of people, especially to the most exposed and vulnerable groups. And we call on all relevant actors to take measures to ensure delivery of humanitarian assistance despite border closures, travel bans, quarantine orders, and difficulties in procurement processes. Thank you, Mr. President.
Representative of Germany for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of South Africa.
Mr. President, from the outset, want to thank you for convening this briefing to address the link between hunger and conflict. And welcome the input, well thought out input by Honorable Prime Minister Miguel Maldonado to our deliberations. We also want to join colleagues in thanking the Director General of Food and Agricultural Organization, the Director of World Food Programme, and the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council for their briefing. And Jan, it's always a pleasure to see you as one of the beneficiaries of your assistance in our previous lives. Mr. President, hunger is both the cause and the effect of war and conflict. The link between hunger and conflict is a persistent issue, and it is therefore comes as no surprise that 60% of people suffering from food insecurity worldwide live in countries affected by conflict. Armed conflict disrupts food system, cause mass displacement of people, destroy livelihoods, and triggers food insecurity. Food insecurity and competition for natural resources has in turn resulted in many current conflicts which we deal with today in this council. These factors set the stage for multiple years of food shortages, especially where conflicts are exacerbated by natural disasters, including impact of climate change. The COVID-19 pandemic will exacerbate the already difficult situation in these countries, as it will cause food shortages, destructive competition for limited resources, and manipulation of food provision. Mr. President, civilians are the primary victims of this vicious cycle of food insecurity and conflict. In particular, women, children, the aged, and people with disabilities. Civilian essential infrastructure, aid convoys, and humanitarian workers are also targeted during conflict situations. In this regard, we emphasize the plight of internally displaced persons, refugees, and migrants who are subjected to difficult living conditions during conflict situations and more than not have limited access to humanitarian assistance, including food. We therefore underscore the importance and urgency of unimpeded access to food, aid, and humanitarian assistance to all vulnerable groups. At the same time, we are witnessing an increase of parties to conflict using hunger as a weapon of war, which constitute a violation of international humanitarian law and can also constitute war crimes. Violations of international humanitarian law must not be condoned, and perpetrators must be held accountable for their actions. In order to do so, and to do more to minimize and prevent conflict-induced hunger, Council could consider the following. First, making more effective use of prevention and early warning systems, such as integrating indicators on alarming food insecurity levels and the restriction of humanitarian access to population in peacekeeping operations and country reports submitted by the Security Council, as the briefers warned us. Second, requiring coordinated and multifaceted responses as well as close cooperation to humanitarian relief and development efforts as part of humanitarian development nexus. 3, promoting gender and age-sensitive humanitarian assistance that remain responsive to the different needs of the populations, thereby ensuring that these needs are integrated in humanitarian response. Fourth, making the provision of adequate health services in conflict area as part of the strategy to eradicate hunger, as Jean was saying. Fourth, take into consideration the impact of economic sanctions imposed on the country in conflict, which may inadvertently also give rise to conflict-related hunger, as civilians could have less access to nutrition and medicine and are faced with higher prices of foodstuffs. And lastly, and 6, ensuring full compliance by all parties to the conflict to relevant international humanitarian law and international human rights law, as well as holding those accountable that violates such international law. Mr. President, in conclusion, let me underscore that peace and food security go hand in hand. In order to end hunger, as the Executive Council, we need to address the root causes of conflict and end all wars in the spirit of silencing the gun, and as the briefers warned us, to avert hunger pandemic. Thank you.
I think the statement for the rest of the South Africa, I give the floor now to St. Vincent the Grenadines.
Thank you, Mr. President. And allow me to also thank His Excellency Miguel Vargas, the Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Dominican Republic, for his statement earlier. We also wish to congratulate you, Mr. President, for convening this very important VTC meeting on protecting civilians from conflict-induced hunger. We also thank our briefers for their very insightful but solemn remarks earlier. Mr. President, today, human civilization stands at an important crossroad where we face the greatest challenges of our lifetime, some of which would inevitably yield the repercussions for generations to come. The COVID-19 pandemic, the likes of which we haven't experienced in over a century, continues to wreak havoc on our societies and economies, while the ever-growing climate crisis casts a precarious shadow over life and livelihoods. In addition to the immense challenges presented by these emerging threats to international peace and security, our fight against hunger persists, and the number of people affected by acute food insecurity continues to rise. We can and we must do better to protect those most vulnerable. Excellencies, in the struggle for lasting peace and prosperity, we can claim no easy victories, yet it is in our darkest hours, when our struggles seem insurmountable, that we must work together, not in spite of, but precisely because. Our distinct interests, perspectives, and priorities demand constructive forms of engagement that yield creative and people-centered solutions. Let us be reminded that our entire multilateral system was designed by our forebears to serve the interests of people. While our individual nation-states remain the primary media through which our geographically dispersed societies interact, these constructs are merely tools of human advancement. To finance the eradication of hunger in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, our government has worked with various partners and donors to implement a mechanism called the Zero Hunger Trust Fund. This initiative combines a number of social programs that span education and training, health and wellness, housing, employment, and productivity to create a social safety net for the most vulnerable groups, and has significantly reduced levels of undernourishment in our Vincentian society. Our delegation proposes that a similar trust fund can be designed and implemented under the auspices of the World Food Programme to cover budgetary shortfalls that stymie the assistance offered to conflict-affected and food-insecure populations. The recent announcement by the WFP to reduce food aid to Houthi-controlled areas in Yemen by half due to reductions in donor support is an absolute tragedy. We must work swiftly and resolutely to ensure that all vulnerable populations in Yemen and elsewhere are afforded this much-needed support. We must be mindful, however, that while conflict is a primary driver of acute food insecurity in some contexts, the hazards of climate change include erratic precipitation, floods, drought, and sea level rise also serve to undermine agricultural productivity and create food insecurity. Additionally, economic recessions and disruptions in supply chains lead to food crises for many vulnerable groups across the world. Mr. President, if we are to end hunger by 2030, a whole-of-system approach is required to tackle food insecurity both within and beyond situations of conflict. This means that the Security Council must make a greater effort to work alongside the Peacebuilding Commission and other entities such as ECOSOC, UNDP, FAO, and WFP to tackle the root causes of insecurity across the peace, security, development, and humanitarian nexus. I thank you.
I thank the representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines for her statement. Now I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Jose. First of all, I would like to thank our briefers today, Mr. Dongyu, David Beasley, and young Egeland. We're also very much honored by the intervention of Dominican Republic Foreign Minister. Today's meeting tackles the critical issue of conflict-induced hunger. Its importance cannot be overestimated. We would like to appreciate the efforts by the Dominican Presidency of the Security Council to coordinate the views of the Council members and to reflect them in the PRST. It is certainly not an easy task, and we still have some way to go in order to come to a sustainable consensus. Having said this, we have to repeat our fundamental position that the Security Council is not the right platform to sustainably embrace and address all the socio-economic and other factors which are related to armed conflicts. We have to be honest to each other and do our best to deal with the issues of peace and security here. This is a well-known distribution of labor within the UN system defined by the Charter that we all need to respect. Discussion or not discussion of an issue in the Security Council should not be criteria of its importance. We also believe that the discussion, wherever it takes place, will not be successful if we ignore the root causes and try to pretend that symptoms are more important than the disease itself. The food security problems of countries in armed conflict is indeed complex and multi-angle. But one of the key root causes, which is often omitted by some of our colleagues, is foreign interference in the internal affairs of states that provokes conflicts and risks to national food security. A vivid evidence of what we all can see every day on the examples of Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen. All of them have become an arena for foreign interference or even settling scores between external players. This must be stopped if we don't want to see a further increase in humanitarian assistance requests, most of which are just to ensure the basic food requirements of the civilians. The medical consequences of a lack of balanced food, especially at a young age, may irreversibly affect health of future grown-ups. The generation of children of hunger wars is growing in our plain view, and this is extremely alarming. Yemen is the largest humanitarian catastrophe of our times, where 2/3 of the population are in need of humanitarian assistance. Half of them are children. In Syria, more than 11 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance. Having all the internal resources for independent development and ensuring the normal life of their citizens, this country is forced to rely on international, in particular food humanitarian assistance. The terms of provision of humanitarian aid are discriminatory and often preconditioned with the regime change. The role of cross-border mechanism is artificially exaggerated at the expense of the existing feasible alternatives provided by Syrian government. Example of this we heard at this today very VTC. Iraq and Libya are also in very difficult situation, struggling to bring life back to normal after unlawful foreign interventions. Mr. President, we do understand that climate change issue is very trendy now, and there is always a temptation to insert it into every discussion. But we need to be frank with ourselves and not to exaggerate its significance for every crisis. Otherwise, we risk to never find right solutions to the issues we face. The expert discussion on the draft PRST revealed that discrepancies on this issue will not bring us to sustainable remedies of the problems of hunger if we continue to ignore the mentioned root causes. Important things that have to be integral part of solutions very often are left outside of the scope of our discussions. Creating opportunities and capacities for local production, stabilizing global commodities markets, trade liberalization, and mitigation of the consequences of natural disasters can reanimate economies ruined by armed conflicts. And one of the most important and obvious ways to address the root causes is to remove unilateral restrictive measures and lift unilateral sanctions. This is a laborious process, but until we take this path, humanitarian needs will only grow. Using medical terminology, the humanitarian assistance is only able to alleviate symptoms, but not cure the disease. We urge our colleagues to embrace these vital ideas that will help us to make the text of the draft PRST acceptable for everybody. Mr. President, the Russian Federation pays great attention to the provision of food assistance to countries in situations of armed conflict. The humanitarian assistance addressed to such states is regularly provided by our country, both through bilateral channels and through the United Nations World Food Programme. Every year we spend more than $40 million on these purposes. WFP's logistics delivery network allows us to be sure that assistance reaches the most vulnerable recipients. Other specialized UN agencies and platforms continue to play a crucial role in addressing various issues of socio-economic nature. Among them, on top of the WFP, the FAO, IFAD, where we are devoted to most effective decision-making process in the governing boards of these agencies. We are also convinced that we have to explore the potential of respective discussions under the auspices of UNGA and ECOSOC. I thank you, Mr. President.
The statement of the Russian Federation. I give now the floor to the representative of France.
Mr. President, I first wish to join others in thanking the Dominican Republic and Minister Vargas for organizing this meeting. I also wish to thank Mr. Xu, Mr. Beasley, and Mr. Egeland for their insightful briefings, as well as through them, their teams helping people on the ground. Mr. President, the link between international peace and security and famine is well documented. We have seen it in recent years in Yemen, South Sudan, Syria, or the Sahel region. There is no doubt that this Council shall deal with this issue, and the more so if we are on the brink of a hunger pandemic, as Mr. Beasley is pointing out. This is the reason why France had taken the initiative of organizing an area meeting on this topic in 2017. We welcome the progress that has been made since, with the adoption of Resolution 2417 in 2018, and the negotiation of a PRST, which will be hopefully agreed very soon. After a steady decline for decades, we have seen worrying trends of rising hunger emerge again since 2015. In 2018, 11% of the world's population suffered from hunger, highlighting the immense challenge of achieving Sustainable Development Goal 2 of zero hunger. Conflicts remain one of the primary drivers of food insecurity. setting in motion a vicious circle. Conflict increases food insecurity, which in turn fuels violence. Conflicts also lead to the displacement of people towards places where food resources are not sufficient to feed local populations, refugees, and internally displaced people altogether. We are all aware that civilians, especially women and children, are the main victims of this vicious circle of food insecurity and armed conflict. Mr. President, it is an appalling reality, but starvation of civilians is still often used as a weapon of war. It is also used as a means of recruitment by parties to armed conflict who deliberately limit access to food and attack humanitarian workers. As we keep repeating meeting after meeting, respect of international humanitarian law is a must in all situations of conflict. All parties must respect the rules of war. In particular, they must respect international humanitarian law provisions protecting civilians, including humanitarian workers. As Mr. Egeland emphasized, parties to conflict must ensure a safe and unhindered access of impartial humanitarian relief to all the people in need. Mr. President, using starvation as a method of warfare against civilians constitutes a war crime under international criminal law. Such crime cannot go unpunished. In addition, I fully concur with the representative of Germany in emphasizing the link between climate change, conflicts, and food insecurity. We must take into account that many countries affected by conflicts also experience firsthand the harmful effects of climate change. The Global Food Crisis Report 2020, which was released today, clearly shows that extreme weather events are becoming an increasingly important contributor to food insecurity. This is notably the case in the Sahel region and aggravates conflict-driven food insecurity. In this context, France regrets that climate change could not be explicitly mentioned in the presidential statement that we are negotiating. We are convinced that climate change is also the driver of displacement, which is another source of the food crisis. France is currently chairing the Platform on Disaster Displacement, PDD, a group of states working together towards a better protection for people displaced in the context of disaster and climate change. Mr. President, I wish to underline the importance of prevention and early warning systems to act more effectively to prevent conflict-induced famine. The UN Secretary General and governments must provide timely information regarding food insecurity levels in order better to anticipate, prevent, and mitigate the effects of a food crisis. We are convinced that improving food security and nutrition contributes to peacekeeping and to the achievement of sustainable development goals. That is why France is increasing its financing of food aid from about 40 million euros in 2019 to more than 50 million euros in 2020. Our food assistance this year covers regions affected by conflicts, while also taking into account the impact of the current COVID-19 crisis. And this is where I would like to conclude. Today, with the propagation of the COVID-19 pandemic, it is more important than ever to reach lasting solutions to the conflicts that lie at the heart of these humanitarian tragedies. We reiterate our full support to the call of the Secretary General for an immediate and global ceasefire to facilitate the response to the pandemic. We have a collective responsibility and a moral obligation in this regard. The Security Council must remain mobilized. France will continue to play its full part in that regard. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France for her statement. I give the floor now to the representative of Tunisia.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank the briefers for their valuable presentations, and I extend a warm welcome to His Excellency Miguel Vargas Maldonado, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Dominican Republic. And I would like to thank Dominican Republic for convening this timely meeting and for choosing this important issue of protecting civilians from conflict-induced hunger, which represents one of the essential priorities in the maintenance of international peace and security. Mr. President, conflicts are being currently on the rise and are characterized by widespread destruction, devastating impacts on civilian populations, increasing numbers of refugees and internally displaced people, and severe hunger and food insecurity. Hunger and malnutrition tied to conflicts are induced through many direct actions of belligerents, as targeted attacks on food resources and related basic infrastructures, blockades or sieges, impediments and restrictions of humanitarian relief, and targeting humanitarian actors and operations. In the long term, conflict impacts such as economic recession, inflation, unemployment, and disruption of essential services contribute also to food insecurity. Some countries in conflict are more vulnerable due to the deadly combination of poverty, violence, hunger, and climate change, which can lead to very high life-threatening levels, especially among women and children. These vulnerabilities are getting higher with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Unfortunately, in many conflict zones, civilians are being prevented from having access to food, and moreover, conflict-induced food insecurity and starvation are used as a method of warfare and a means of pressure for achieving political ends. As we condemn these practices, which represent an outrage upon the personal dignity and inalienable rights of these populations, and a grave violation of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, we support all measures that lead to the full implementation of the Resolution 2417 of 2018, especially in terms of prevention, response, promotion of compliance, and accountability. Mr. President, as we appreciate and support all the efforts undertaken by the United Nations, the World Food Programme, and humanitarian organizations in response to worsening food crisis in conflict zones to alleviate the suffering of civilians, we reiterate the urgent need to continue and multiply international efforts to address all factors that undermine food security and nutrition. In this regard, efforts to support resilient livelihood and achieve sustainable development must be combined with peace building and conflict resolution efforts. Within the actual situation, it is vital to put an end to all forms of using starvation as a method of warfare and to the unlawful denial of humanitarian access. The devastating impacts of these abuses on the civilian populations and children in particular can affect their lives and last for decades, even after the political settlement of the conflicts. Thank you.
Thank the representative for a statement. I give the floor to the representative of Belgium.
Thank you, Jose, Mr. President. I would like to thank you for your leadership on this topic of conflict-induced hunger, which is illustrated by this briefing today, as well as your initiative for a presidential statement, which we support. We also salute the participation of your foreign minister to this meeting. I then would like to thank our distinguished briefers for reminding us what this topic is all about. It's about states not protecting their own civilians, about starving civilians, about warring parties denying humanitarian access, attacking civilians and civilian infrastructure, destroying livelihoods, cattle, and agricultural fields, and the disproportionate impact of all this on the most vulnerable, especially on children. It is also about governments impeding humanitarian assistance by imposing administrative obstacles and restrictions, and about the difficulties humanitarian organizations experience due to adverse effects of counterterrorism measures and sanctions. And it's also about the less visible effects from conflict-induced hunger. When a whole generation suffers from malnutrition, the long-term consequences compromise the prosperity of the whole society, as well as its prospect for sustainable peace. All 15 members of the Council recognized these challenges when they adopted unanimously Resolution 2417. And you asked what can be done to better implement that resolution. Well, we believe there are actually many actions the Council and the Member States can undertake to prevent conflicts from causing or aggravating hunger. I will just name a few which are, of course, inspired by Resolution 2417. First, states who have influence on parties to conflicts should use this influence in order to incite compliance with international humanitarian law. For example, by supporting national investigations and encouraging member states in the jurisdiction of which violations are committed to ensure accountability. Second, if and when national jurisdiction fail to take action, the Council has the tools to trigger a range of international investigation and accountability mechanisms. We welcome in this respect the amendment to the Rome Statute to include as a war crime intentionally starving civilians as a method of warfare, also in non-international armed conflicts. We call on member states to adhere to the Rome Statute and to ratify this amendment. Third, the Council should also continue to sanction individuals or entities obstructing humanitarian access, giving appropriate protection of civilians mandates to peace operations, and having them engage in dialogues on access challenges are other examples. Finally, we believe that the Secretary General also has an important role to play in alerting the Security Council when the risk of conflict-induced famine and widespread food insecurity in the context of armed conflict occurs, and in providing us with the necessary information during country-specific and protection of civilian briefings. To conclude, Mr. President, we would like to underline that populations in armed conflicts, weakened by years of violence, destruction, and malnutrition, pushed to their limits by the adverse effects of climate change, are now once again particularly vulnerable to the spread of COVID-19. We therefore fully support the Secretary General's call for global ceasefire to ensure adequate response to the pandemic. We also recall that COVID-19 does not exempt governments from their obligations under international human rights and humanitarian law. And we call on all member states to avoid that COVID-related restrictions would curtail the ability of humanitarian actors to provide assistance. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Belgium for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Niger.
Thank you, Jose. I would like to start by quoting the Secretary General when he said, "The most effective way to protect civilians is to prevent conflict." To that end, and in pursuit of that goal, protection of civilians has become one of the core issues of our Council agenda. I would therefore like to thank you, Mr. President, for convening this open debate on this very subject with the participation of your Minister for Foreign Affairs. Allow me to take this opportunity to also thank our briefers, Director General for Food and Agriculture Organization, Executive Director of the United Nations World Food Programme, and the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council. Mr. President, conflict is now the leading cause of acute hunger around the world. In the Sahel and the Lake Chad Basin, where much of the population live from agriculture and where climate change is already exacerbating tensions, an acute food crisis has been precipitated by the ongoing conflict and intensifying insurgent activities. 3.5 million people are projected to face acute to severe food insecurity in the Lake Chad Basin. To that number, we can add another 3.3 million people in need of immediate assistance in the Central Sahel. I fully share what has been said by Mr. Egeland in this regard. As mentioned by OCHA, populations find themselves having to flee and leave their fields, livestock, and other food sources behind. This escalates food insecurity for both forcibly displaced people and their host communities, who are often providers of the last resort despite their already scarce resources. Mr. President, recent years have seen progress made regarding the protection of civilians in armed conflict through the implementation of a comprehensive protection framework based on international humanitarian law and Security Council practices. However, more remains to be done in places such as the Lake Chad Basin, dramatically affected by climate change, and where Boko Haram is active, or Yemen, where restrictions to land and sea routes is commonplace, and many other conflict zones. Thousands of people are trapped without life-saving humanitarian assistance. We hold the strong belief that all people deserve full access to humanitarian aid. This is why my delegation would like to join its voice to the one of all the members of this council in strongly condemning the use of starvation of civilians as a method of warfare and of the unlawful denial of access to humanitarian assistance and humanitarian personnel to the civilian population in armed conflict. We would also like to remind all parties of their obligations under international humanitarian law and the need to bring perpetrators of violations and abuses to justice. Mr. President, repeated attacks on the human dignity of population and the enjoyment of their rights as a result of acts of intercommunal violence or non-state armed groups in the Sahel further exacerbate the fragility of those populations. Women and children are the first victims of such violence and suffer significant trauma. We would like to stress the need for humanitarian assistance to be gender and age sensitive and to be inclusive of those groups in the process of building more resilient and sustainable communities. Every major outbreak in recent memory, whether it is Ebola, SARS, or MERS, has had both direct and indirect negative impacts on food security. But the novel coronavirus, COVID-19, may prove especially deadly for people living in conflict zones and suffering from acute hunger. Various factors related to the pandemic are exacerbating the challenges in regions already facing large humanitarian crises. Labor shortages are undermining crop production and processing. Disruption due to transport blockages and quarantine measures will prevent farmers from accessing markets, and confinement measures could hinder the humanitarian aid and thus the distribution of much needed food to refugees and IDPs. Niger has put in place a response plan in favor of the population estimated at nearly $500 million in food. The forecast support plan provides for a mobilization or more than 80,000 tons of cereals for sale at moderate prices and more than or about 60,000 tons for the food distribution to the most vulnerable. As you may also know, thanks to a bold policy implemented by President Issoufou through the 3N initiative, Nigerian Feed Nigerians, which has made it possible to ensure food self-sufficiency, it has been proven that drought is no longer a fatality and that it is not synonymous of famine. However, in the face of COVID-19, this dynamic must be supported at the national, regional, and international levels. This brings me to my other point. That is, as was said in the beginning of my intervention, the most effective way to protect civilians is to prevent conflict. And prevention includes acknowledging and addressing deep-seated chronic and acute vulnerabilities affecting those countries. It also requires a concerted action by governments, the humanitarian community, and development actors to tackle the structural root causes of vulnerabilities and strengthening the resilience of the affected communities. One of the solutions could be a better use of scientific advances, including the peaceful application of nuclear research for agro-meteorological and development purposes. To conclude, Mr. President, I would like to remind us that in May 2018, this very body unanimously adopted Resolution 2417. We hope this resolution will continue to guide our actions to break the cycle of conflict-related hunger sooner rather than later. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Niger for its statement. I give the floor now to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you so much to your Foreign Minister, Maldonado, for being with us today. And of course, it's always great to see my friend David Beasley. I'm glad that you're doing well and that you're healthy. Absolutely. It's great to see you. And thank you, Director General Chu, for your briefing today. And so much, we owe you such a tremendous food and obligation to care for those on the margins of society. Ensuring that every single person has enough to eat is one of the fundamental ways we meet that obligation. So I really do want to commend again our briefers today for all their contributions in making certain that every single person does have food available. The United States would also like to thank
We lost you.
Especially today, as
Can you repeat the last paragraph?
Can
Kelly,
you hear
we
me?
lost you. Yes, now yes. Repeat the last paragraph, please. lost you, Kelly.
Also, like
Can't hear you.
Hear me
you
now?
want to reboot? Yes. Let's see. No, I can't hear you.
The United States would also like to thank the Republic for encouraging to return to the topic of food insecurity and hunger. Today's
Should you reboot and give your speech after Vietnam, Kelly? We're losing you again.
important.
You want to reboot
At the number statement.
your computer?
Okay. I'm on.
Now you're on, but we lost half your statement.
The United States would also like to thank the Dominican Republic for encouraging the Security Council to return to the topic of food insecurity and hunger. Today's conversation is especially important, as in the statement that Sven gave, we are approaching an acute food insecurity that could nearly double this year to 265 million due to the economic and due to the
Kelly. Kelly, I lost you. Rodney, should we give Vietnam and come back to Kelly? Rodney? What do you think, James?
Suggest you go to Vietnam.
Yes. Okay, I will give the floor to Vietnam. You have the floor.
First, I would like to thank the Dominican Republic Presidency for timely organizing these very important briefings. And I also would like to thank His Excellency Minister of Foreign Affairs for his statement. I also thank the three briefers for their insightful briefings today and update. Mr. President, almost 2 years after Resolution 2417, the links between armed conflict and violence and conflict-induced food insecurity and the threats of famines have become more evident. Yet the vicious circles between armed conflict and food insecurity still remains. According to the Global Report of Food Crisis 2020, the numbers of people in worse situation of food insecurity has risen by tens of millions. That increase was due to the worsening situation in conflict-driven crisis. A total of almost about 77 million people suffering from acute food crisis come from such countries. In many other recent reports, it also shows that about 2/3 of the world's food security crises are in countries which have armed conflict and are on the agenda of Security Council. Women, children, refugees, internal displaced persons, and other vulnerable groups particularly suffer from the impact of multiple threats, conflicts, hunger, malnutrition, disease, and including the COVID-19 pandemic recently. Conflict continues to be one of the major drivers for food insecurity, causing displacement people from their farming and for pastoral lands and disruption of their livelihood, causing devastating humanitarian consequences. And at the same time, food insecurity and famine can create social tension, exacerbate conflicts, breed new ones, and undermine peace effort and provide incentive for men and women and children to be recruited. And so the cycle that continues. It is high time for our efforts must aim at breaking that vicious circle between armed conflict and food insecurity. And in this regard, I would like to share the following point. First, we stress the importance of ensuring full implementation by all parties to armed conflicts of their respective obligation under international humanitarian law and the Resolution 2417. Civilian infrastructures, which is critical to ensure food security, as well as objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, must be protected. We join others in condemning the use of starvation as the warfare methods in a number of conflicts and reject the unlawful denial of humanitarian access and all other action in violations of international humanitarian law. Second, in responding effectively to the humanitarian need in armed conflict area, we need to adopt a consistent people-centered and sustained approach by United Nations system and the world community. We commend the untiring efforts of the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, and the World Food Program, WFP, in providing food to millions of people. Adequate funding and support from international donors is essential to meet the need of global humanitarian assistance at this time. The assistance should be prioritized to address the worst situations where it matters the most and find ways and means to navigate in this time of the COVID-19 pandemic. And at the same time, we must work together to supporting affected countries to enhance long-term recovery, improve livelihood, build resilience, guarantee the availability and marketability of and accessibility to food, therefore averting the risk of relapsing into food insecurity. We take this opportunity to stress the importance of full, equal, and effective participation of women in conflict prevention, peace building, and particularly in achieving food security. Third, the best prevention of the conflict-induced hunger is undoubtedly the prevention of armed conflict altogether. There is a lot of wisdom and plenty of lessons learned around the world in preventive diplomacy and peace building that we can benefit from. The Secretary General contextual report on the humanitarian situation and responses, as well as report by relevant United Nations agencies on the situation of armed conflict and food security are a good reference for the Council to close monitor and respond to the situation of conflict-related famine and starvation. Last but not least, the COVID-19 pandemic threatened further food insecurity in conflict situations due to the disrupted production and distribution and other disease control measures. We continue to ask all parties to armed conflict to respond to the Secretary General call for a humanitarian ceasefire and facilitate timely delivery of food and other basic humanitarian aid to the affected people so that they too can have equal opportunity to respond to the pandemic. I thank you, Mr. President.
The representative of Vietnam for state, give the floor now to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Can everybody hear me? Since our ambassador was disconnected and has been unable to reconnect to this system, I will deliver the remarks of the United States from this point. I'll pick up where she left off. The United States would also like to thank the Dominican Republic for encouraging the Security Council to return to the topic of food insecurity and hunger. Today's conversation is especially important as we approach the 2-year anniversary of the adoption of Resolution 2417, which acknowledged the clear connection between conflict and hunger. In a perfect world, our discussion today would focus on the positive trajectories we are beginning to see in some countries, where there has been progress in the decoupling of violence and hunger. However, we cannot ignore the downward trends we are seeing in places like Northeast Nigeria, South Sudan, and Cameroon. In these areas, insecurity and a lack of humanitarian assistance access is causing enormous disruption to the lives and livelihoods of millions of women, children, and men. Furthermore, we cannot turn a blind eye to the horrific and continuing impact of armed conflict on millions of Syrians and Yemenis. Innocent people are suffering because they are unable to acquire or produce food. Practically speaking, what this means is that because of constant insecurity, or in cases like Syria's, the use of humanitarian aid as a weapon by a despotic regime, families and individuals cannot sustain themselves. It is deeply troubling that, in some cases, states use hunger as a tactic of war. They deploy siege tactics to prevent civilians from accessing food and even impede and harass humanitarian actors trying to help. This behavior is cruel, it's inexcusable under any circumstance, and especially so in the midst of a global health crisis. States cannot ignore applicable obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. As we speak, humanitarian needs are at unprecedented levels. With this in mind, it is of paramount importance that this Council call out those states that are failing to uphold their most basic responsibility to protect the people within their borders. We all know that international humanitarian assistance is vital, but it is only a temporary solution for meeting human need that is created in many cases by conflict. The only long-term solution is for states to act responsibly in the interests of all people living within their borders. The Secretary General has outlined a reform agenda to make immediate and long-term efforts more effective and efficient. And I want to close by noting two important and concrete elements of that agenda. First, we must improve coordination between humanitarian, development, and peace actors. And second, we must prioritize the timely and reliable financing of relief aid. These are the areas where this Council can, should, and must make greater strides in reducing hunger and conflict-related suffering, strides that are in keeping with our responsibility to care for those on the margins. Thank you, Mr. President.
Of the United States for his statement. I would like now want to thank the briefers for their very clear statements of the situation. Since there are no more names inscribed on the speaker list, I would have to adjourn the session, the meeting. Thank you.